Okay, I wanted to give another demonstration here of the center of mass and specifically the relationship between the pose and the posture of the body and the location of the center of mass and how this can affect the way that you move and your ability to, for example, hold a specific posture of the body. We call this postural control in the parlance of biomechanics, the biomechanics of standing still, essentially. So a good example of where biomechanics isn't necessarily all about movement. It's often about movement, but sometimes it's also about the absence of movement. So let's head over to my COVID pandemic in-house biomechanics lab here, also known as my kitchen. Oh, someone asked to see the dog. She's doing okay. Here she is, little Freya. Yeah, she strained something the other day. We're not sure what, so she's moving kind of slow, but I think she'll be okay. Aren't you, girl? Yeah, good girl. Okay, so here is my lab for now, also known as my kitchen. And let's see if I can set this up so you guys can see most of me, hopefully. Hopefully you can hear this. I'm a little ways from the microphone here. I'll try and speak up. Okay, when I'm standing here in my neutral anatomical position, my center of mass is roughly in my belly button region, so roughly right around here somewhere. And you want to think of that as not being like in that position because it's somehow like anatomically constrained to be there, like it's there because of like the size and shape of my body. It's there because that's where my body mass is concentrated when I'm in this pose right here. If I move parts of my body around, my center of mass is also moving around. Specifically, if I move some of my mass to the right, then my center of mass also moves to the right. So think of the center of mass not as being located on a specific part of the body, like in relation to the hip or the sternum or the ear or anything like that. Think of it as being where the mass of the body is currently concentrated based on the distribution of that mass around that balance point. Okay? Now let me show you an example here of how this affects human movement, how the position of the center of mass affects human movement. And I'll also connect this to something that we talked about last lecture, which is those torques, those rotational forces in human movement. So forces that cause rotation of the body. As I'm standing upright here, in my upright, just standing posture here, gravity is pulling me down into the ground. And because that gravitational vector, so think of my center of mass being right about here, and a force vector due to gravity acting downward towards the ground through my center of mass, because that gravitational vector is passing more or less straight through the center of all three of my main leg joints there, my hip and my knee and my ankle. Because my weight is passing roughly straight through the center of those joints, it's pretty easy for me to stand still here. I don't have to generate a great deal of muscular force and muscular effort at my joints just to stand still and upright here. It takes a little bit, but not very much. Now, what happens here to my center of mass and to the muscular effort that it takes to stand still as I start leaning forward further and further here? Okay, you can kind of slowly and subtly see me leaning forward there. And now let's see what happens when I lean forward progressively further and further and when I lean forward too much. And this is an example I described to some of you in some emails, and I wanted to show a visual demonstration of it here. So let's see what happens when I lean forward too much, and then I'll explain why I had to do what I'm about to do here mechanically. Okay, so I'm standing upright, and I'm going to lean forward further and further and further, and eventually I have to take a step. Okay. Now, mechanically, what was happening there? Why did I have to take that step there? Let's walk through that in relation to the center of mass and in relation to the rotational forces, specifically at my ankle joint. Okay. As I'm standing upright here, my body where my center of mass is located right about here, roughly in my belly button region, and that force vector due to gravity is acting straight down. Okay. Now, that force vector passes more or less straight through the center of my ankle joint, okay? So think about taking that force vector, going straight down, and multiplying it by how far it is in this horizontal direction from my ankle joint there, okay? Now, because it runs pretty much straight through my ankle joint, not quite, but it's really close to running straight through my ankle joint, it's not really generating any appreciable torque or any appreciable rotational force at my ankle. Okay? That gravitational force gets multiplied by whatever really tiny distance it is in front of or behind the ankle joint, and that product there, the gravitational force times the horizontal distance it is from my ankle joint, is the torque or the rotational force it produces at the ankle that's going to kind of rotate me in this forward direction. Okay? Now, because it's passing straight through the ankle there, that distance in the horizontal direction is pretty much zero, and so it's not really producing any appreciable torque there at my ankle that's going to topple me over. Okay? Now, watch what happens when I lean forward here further and further. Okay? As I lean forward like this, my center of mass moves in the forward direction because I'm translating the mass of my body forward. So as my mass moves forward in this global reference frame, my center of mass also moves forward. Okay? Now, my center of mass is right around here, and its force vector for gravity is still pointing straight down, but notice now it's an appreciable distance in front of my ankle joint back there. It's about, I don't know, maybe 6 inches, 10 inches or so in front of my ankle joint there. Okay? So now that weight, that gravitational force vector, which is still just going to be my body weight, is going to get multiplied by that 6 inches, 10 inches or so of distance it is in front of the ankle joint, and that's going to produce a greater torque at my ankle that's going to tend to topple me over and then kind of rotate me in this forward direction. Now, how do I stop that? Well, I'm also producing a torque at my ankle in the opposite direction. Okay? So as I'm leaning forward here, gravity is producing a torque at my ankle in, for you guys, what would be the clockwise direction on the screen. And to counteract that and to stand still statically here in this kind of forward leaned posture, I'm also producing a torque at my ankles in the counterclockwise direction, in the opposite direction. Now, where is that counterclockwise torque at my ankle coming from? That's coming from my ground reaction force. Okay? So as I lean forward further and further here, gravity is producing a bigger and bigger clockwise torque at my ankle because I'm moving my center of mass forward further and further from my ankle. And I'm counteracting that by producing a ground reaction force on my toes here that is in the opposite direction and balancing out that clockwise torque from the weight at my ankle there. Okay? Now, what happens here when I lean forward further and further? My center of mass keeps moving forward, meaning the clockwise torque due to gravity at my ankle keeps getting bigger and bigger, meaning to continue to stand still in this posture, I have to keep producing a bigger and bigger counterclockwise torque at my ankle from my toes, from my ground reaction force. I can do that by pressing my toes harder into the floor, and that's going to do two things. It's going to make that ground reaction force bigger, and it's going to move the ground reaction force further along my foot, further away from my ankle. Okay? So basically, as I lean forward further and further, my center of mass gets further in front of my ankles, and so to counteract that, I have to move my ground reaction force further and further along my toes so that I keep getting a bigger and bigger torque in the opposite direction from the torque that gravity is producing due to my weight and my center of mass moving forward here. Now, eventually, I get to here, and I either have to fall on my face or I have to take a step. Now, what's happening there with that step? When I took the step, that's when my ground reaction force is clear on the end of my toes. Okay, I can't move it forward any further. Oh. Sorry, I lost my video there. There we go. As I lean forward here, like as far as I can go, the reason that's as far as I can go is now my ground reaction force is clear on the end of my toes. I can't move it forward any further. And so if I keep leaning my center of mass further forward beyond that, then gravity is going to win. I'm going to have a bigger gravity torque at the ankle than my ground reaction force torque in the other direction, and that clockwise torque is going to win out and I'm going to fall over. Okay? So to stop that, I have to either fall on my face, not stop it, or I have to take a step. Now, what's that step doing? It's moving at least part of my ground reaction force way far forward, this big, huge distance up here. Okay? So now I've effectively balanced out that gravitational torque by kind of extending my base support there. I'm no longer limited just to the distance of my toes there in the front. Okay? So just an example there of how the posture, the pose of the body affects where the center of mass is, and how this can have an effect on how people move and how people stand still, and the muscular effort it takes at certain muscles of certain joints to counteract the effect of gravity based on the position of the center of mass.